going to cause rationing and shortages. So the idea was to encourage civilians to fill in the shortfall as much as they could by growing as much of their own as they could. There were lectures and pamphlets and official encouragements. And the thing is that people responded in droves. They dug up their backyards. They dug up their front yards. All of a sudden, it was socially correct to be growing potatoes in your front lawn. They grew in pots on driveways, on rooftops. They grew in window boxes. They expanded the production of fruits and vegetables in the United States by 40%. That's 40 for the peak years of that. It was really huge. It actually drives me nuts when I walk around my neighborhood and I see all the sunny lawns that could be growing food instead of grass. We could basically solve world hunger if we fully implemented urban and suburban growing. And I've kind of looked into that. I'm not just making that up. So the original idea then was an artifact of a particular time and a situation. The need for extra food to be grown during the two world wars. It pretty quickly morphed and developed into a lot more than that. And one of the earlier examples of that development comes from Cuba. People, raise hands if you've heard about Cuba's special time. Yeah, one or two of you, okay. That's kind of what I thought might be. What happened was that during the Cold War era, Cuba was a client state of the Soviet Union, and they were doing industrial agriculture, chemical agriculture, raising cash crops, trading them at, selling them at very good terms to the Soviet Union and buying from the Soviet Union the agricultural chemicals, the petroleum, and 80% of the food that Cubans ate. That was about the only trading partner Cuba had because there was an American embargo on Cuba. And then one day the Soviet Union wasn't there anymore. And Cuba was suddenly in a food supply crash emergency. What happened, and giving credit where it was due, nobody starved, as might have happened. But they instituted rationing and everybody got hungry, but they managed to get some food to everybody while going into overdrive to completely switch their agriculture from chemical cash crops to food production. And as it turned out, to organic food production. They bred oxen to pull plows so that, because oxen can pull plows without needing oil. They eat grass. And in fact, the residue of their digestive processes after eating that grass is good fertilizer. So you start closing the circle there. They bred oxen to pull plows. They learned how to grow food without chemical fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides. And the main thing, the other big thing they did was they encouraged every Cuban who had a square foot of space to grow food. In the cities, the public parks were given over to people having little plots. And they massively encouraged everyone who could grow food to do so. They gave all kinds of assistance, seeds, and composted manure. And the people of Cuba responded because everybody could see that they needed to. They grew food, again, front yards, backyards, rooftops, little bits of pavement where you could put a pot, anything. It took them 3 years. At the end of 3 years, they were growing enough calories to feed every Cuban adequately. And again, it was the urban, suburban food production that increased the capacity by, again, about 40%. So that was another development and another kind of proof of what can happen. Other developments kind of in the same time frame have been the growth of community gardens. What happens with a community garden is a bunch of neighbors decide this would be a good idea, identify a plot of land that can be grown in inner cities where it is kind of a major response to the phenomenon of food deserts. It might be a matter of finding a vacant lot and clearing out the garbage. In where I live in Braintree, Massachusetts. We have a group developed an association called Sustainable Braintree, and a couple of people from Sustainable Braintree identified a piece of a public park kind of screened from the street by a line of trees to the north end of the park. That's important. It means the sun shines on the garden and the shadows go the other way. And they identified this, and they talked to the town officials and got permission to use that as a community garden. And they arranged for water to be a source of water to be brought in. So it works different ways in different kinds of settings. In inner cities, sometimes they're working with the people, the officials of the municipality, and sometimes it's kind of a guerrilla garden. And sometimes the officials eventually try to shut down the guerrilla garden, and sometimes they don't succeed. It becomes a big public thing. With community, so basically it's a matter of finding a plot, getting it either divided up into, sometimes you have to do a soil test, and if the soil is really bad, they may decide to put in raised beds. But basically, each person or family that wants to participate gets assigned a plot. In our community garden in Braintree, there's often a waiting list. And then if somebody moves or can't do it anymore, whoever's next on the waiting list gets a plot. Most community gardens have some ground rules, and one of the ground rules is very often that it be done organically. In our garden, we have a work day at the beginning of the season to kind of clean everything up and get it going. And then everybody just goes and does their gardening whenever they want to. And sometimes you meet other people and sometimes you're there by yourself. But then we have a big potluck in the late summer. And then in the fall, we have a cleanup day. And that's how it works for us. As I mentioned, community gardens are also pretty, there are many urban inner city areas where it's a really good thing because people who live in apartments and who don't have a lot of land around their homes can still have a chance to garden that way and to grow some food. And very often with inner city community gardens, it starts to become a rallying point for people to start taking control of their lives and growing community spirit as well as food. So that was the Cuban experience, the community garden application of this sort of thing. I've already started mentioning organic gardening. I mentioned soil and soil health because the next development of the concept was one that addresses that whole aspect of it. It's a couple of years ago, I'm a member of a group called Green America, and they started talking about climate victory garden as a term. And the idea being to suggest to people that that whatever food gardening they're going to do, that they do it in ways that are part of the climate solution. And the reason, I guess everybody here is probably well aware that there's too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that we need to do more than just stop burning fossil fuels and putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We need to draw carbon down out of the atmosphere in order to stabilize the climate. And organic soil, living soil, let me rephrase, when you garden organically and bring the soil to life, that living soil is what brings down is what pulls carbon down out of the atmosphere. I see a chat question. Could I repeat my name? Louise Quigley, Q-U-I-G-L-E-Y is my name. Okay, so I'm talking about how organic gardening actually performs this miracle. It seems that from what I can understand, and I believe the science is still being developed on this, but from what I understand, the way it works is that, as we all know, plants inhale carbon dioxide. They exhale oxygen. That's why we can all have oxygen to breathe on this world. But they pull in more carbon dioxide. They pull in more carbon than they use. And the excess gets exuded in their roots into the soil, where if the soil is alive and has lots of microorganisms and fungi in it, then the fungi and microorganisms absorb that carbon and incorporate it into their bodies and keep it in the soil. So it's a matter of having living soil. Just farming or gardening isn't part of the climate solution. And in fact, if you're doing chemical gardening and therefore the soil is not very lively, it's actually releasing carbon from the soil. So it's part of the problem. If you're doing regenerative or organic or whatever we call it, gardening or farming, that's putting carbon back into the soil and keeping it there. And by the way, you can also, even if you're not growing food, but if you have a lawn, that can also be managed organically. And there also, if you transition a lawn from being managed chemically to being managed organically, you change that from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. If anybody is interested in changing the lawn to organic production, you just stop using chemicals. Instead of fertilizer, you apply compost or composted manure or any soil amendment that the bag says suitable for organic agriculture. You top dress, you just scatter it on the top and the rain will soak it in. You mow high, about 2.5 or 3 inches, so that the roots will be longer and retain more moisture and keep it healthy. And you just mow it regularly and keep it looking nice and smooth. And from 10 feet away, when people driving down the street won't be able to tell that there's that there are clovers in it, or even dandelions. So, and when you bring your soil back to life, you're sequestering carbon in every square inch. I actually had some very instructive experience in bringing dead soil back to life. What happened was I married my permanent spouse in 1990. We were living in Wisconsin at the time, the Milwaukee area. And we bought a house, and the house had, between the house and the garage, there was a paved patio. And we wanted to turn some of that into a kitchen garden. So we broke up some concrete, we built the raised beds, and we needed soil to fill it. My husband had grown up on a farm in the next county, half an hour drive. And his parents still lived there, but they were retired and renting the land out to a farmer who was growing soybeans chemically. So nobody was going to object if we went and picked up a load of soil and brought it back to fill our raised beds. So we did that. And I planted, this was like June, I planted a bunch of different crops. Everything came up, and everything except the bush beans immediately died. Because I had noticed there were like no worms in the entire load of soil. Apparently, the farmer who was using it had sprayed something that would kill everything except the legumes. And so the bush beans survived, but because he had been growing soybeans. So bush beans are closely related to that, closely enough that they survived, but everything else died, at which point I decided that soil was too toxic. I didn't want to even eat anything out of it. What I did was I planted bush beans on the whole thing, and I just let them grow, and then in the fall I dug it in. That's called a green manure, when you grow some plants and then just dig it into the soil as an amendment to add organic matter to the soil. So that was the first year. And the rain rained and the sun shone and we went through a winter. The second year, I again planted a variety of crops, and they all survived. They did okay. They weren't great, but they did okay, and I was not afraid to eat them. And I could see there were starting to be earthworms, and there were starting to be other insect life around. By the third summer, that soil was alive. There were worms, and there were spiders in the garden, and there were beetles, and there were butterflies, and there were dragonflies, and it had all come back to life. And this is, in fact, very congruent with with organic standards. If you're a farmer and you want to switch from chemical agriculture to being an organic grower, it takes 3 years of zero application of chemicals. And at the end of 3 years of that, during those 3 years, it's transitional organic. And at the end of 3 years, you're fully organic and you can get certified as such. That's all it takes to bring dead soil back to life, which I find a very hopeful thought. And it's worth doing because soil, as I said, that's chemically treated is really part of the climate problem. But when soil is managed organically and food or regeneratively, whatever term we use, it sequesters carbon. It's part of the climate solution. And gardening is great exercise, and it's a way to get some fresh air, even when you're socially distancing. And you get food, and it tastes good. So that's what home growing or community garden growing is about. Tasty, healthful food, solving hunger, growing community, and carbon drawdown. And we want to open this up to discussion or answering questions. But I don't know what your questions are. So people need to, we need to now open it up so that people can ask questions.
There's questions in the chat window, Louise.
Excuse me, I have a cat in front of my computer. Cat move. Okay. Okay. Someone says that to find out if your soil is safe to grow food in, you can have it tested at UMass Amherst. And Green City Growers. And the question is, I'm growing in a city. Is building soil life in raised beds the same as when growing directly in the ground? And the answer is yes. However you're growing, you need to watch it and make sure that it's getting enough moisture. On a day like this in Massachusetts, when we're having a rainstorm, that's not a problem. As it gets into summer, when there's you need to just make sure that you're getting enough water in there, I think. But yeah, raised bed gardening, obviously, whatever you fill the bed with should be clean fill, and also you should use organic amendments. But it's pretty much the same thing, yeah. There's a question, are we going to talk about Jewish values? And I don't see all of the question. For Michael Bernholtz. I'm not sure how to see the rest of your question, Michael.
Well, I can read it to you. Are we going to talk about Jewish values of that great garden work, carbon sequestration, and growing our own food?
Yeah, that's all that I see. I'm not sure which particular Jewish values you're thinking of.
I would just say that there's a lot of options there. In terms of, starting out in the very beginning, the idea that we are supposed to, lovdo v'shomro, we're supposed to work the earth, but also to work it, but also that verb is also the same one of the temple service. So it's also an idea of giving service or even worship. In the temple, it was talked about, and also to the shmor, to guard it. So a lot of times it's translated as to till and to tend the earth, but I like to think about it more in terms of that idea of our service to this amazing sacred earth that we're part of, and also and to guard it and protect it and take care of it. So, we're getting our food from the land, but at the same time, we need to be working in service of it and taking care of it. And I think that the ways that you're talking about the restorative agriculture is organic and restoring the soil. These are things that really fit nicely into that particular way of thinking about it. I mean, there are lots. Because Judaism is so based in the land and its origins, there are just lots and lots of options to choose from, but I'll just toss that out as a starting place.
Okay, I also see some questions about what do you plant if you have a limited space? And that's, well, in a sense, everybody's space is finite. But yeah, for example, in a community garden, my plot there is 6 feet by 12 feet. I can't grow everything. So you make choices about what you want to eat. You make choices about what's the best use of your limited land. And it's going to be different for different people. Something like corn takes a lot of space, pounds of food. Something like potatoes might give you more food for the same amount of space. Tomatoes might be just what you adore eating. or peppers, or so that partly it's a matter of, if you're limited space, it's partly a matter of what you want to eat and what you want to devote the space to, and that's going to be a personal option. As long as you're growing food that you like and you're growing it regeneratively, it's entirely up to you. There is a question about how much sun do you get, and yeah, that's a big important thing, because most food grows best in sun, by which we mean at least 6 to 8 hours of full sun a day. These days, when we're sitting around our houses, looking out our windows, if we're going to be going around our own homes, you can watch your land and see where the sun falls. Generally speaking, if you have sun coming in from the west all afternoon, you're generally going to be getting enough sun. If you have trees and structures to the south, that's going to cast shadows in the middle of the day and going to make it real hard to have enough sun within the shadows of your structures. You do want to look for the spot of land that gets the most sun, because that'll be the most productive.
There was a question back at the beginning about, could you address the difference between permaculture, regenerative agriculture, and our backyard gardens?
Sure thing. Permaculture, as I understand it, is a whole concept of growing food in ways that allow the food to kind of grow itself as much as possible. So you're talking a lot about tree production of food, fruits and nuts, about plants that will self-seed. And if you grow open-pollinated plants, that is varieties that are a true variety, that come true from seed, that are not hybrids, then many of them I've had radishes self-seed, I've had lettuces self-seed, I've had tomatoes self-seed, and where I was growing them, then the next year new ones show up in the garden, and that's always fun, and I try to welcome and use them as much as I can. Permaculture, so it's a shortening of permanent agriculture, and it's a way of setting up a whole area of land that will as much as possible produce food without you having to clear it and tend it and replant it every year. So it's using a lot more perennials than the annual food crops. Although, as I say, many of the annual food crops will self-seed. It's usually, it can and should be done organically, regeneratively. I mean, it lends itself to, it's a different sort of thing, but it lends itself to being used, because with permaculture, you're trying to do it with as little input as possible. So obviously as little chemical input as possible. So it lends itself to being done in a regenerative way. Did I answer the question?
Can you speak about the merits of any downsides of no-till gardening? No-till actually is a benefit. And that's, I didn't mention that before, but people are talking more and more about no-till agriculture, because one of the things that helps soil to sequester carbon is these fungi that develop these long filaments underground. And the less you till, the less you disturb those filaments, and the less you disturb the filaments, the more carbon that soil can sequester.
So there's a lot of talk now about using cover crops so that the soil is always supplying carbon to microorganisms, and also of doing as little tilling as possible. Last year I started really going to no-till when I need to seed beans or radishes, the kind of things that grow from seed rather than seedlings. I just make a line in the soil, put the seeds in, cover it over. I don't do any more deep digging. I do add compost and composted manure as amendments, but I just top dress and let the wind and the rain wash it down and add it to the soil from that way. So yeah, no-till is a big deal as far as carbon sequestration goes.
And do you have any recommendations for vegetables and fruits that grow well in partial shade?
Oh, no. That said, the food plants that are cool weather, cool season crops, like lettuces, spinach, peas, can take a bit more shade than things like tomatoes and beans that really do need full sun. Although, as I said, full sun if you have 6 to 8 hours a day. So like part of my best land in my garden is my front yard, which is to the west of my house. So it doesn't come into sun until lunchtime, but it gets enough sun in the afternoon. So it's not full sun location, but it's enough sun. There are some perennial plants that you can grow in part shade. Strawberries, hazelnuts, raspberries can kind of grow on the edge of woodland sometimes, so they may be okay for part sun. I don't know if anybody else knows more than I do about that. They should, okay, somebody wrote, Deb wrote, strawberries and lettuces grow well in part shade. I mentioned them. Nightshades like peppers, eggplants, and tomatoes need lots of sun. So someone wrote, I'm growing clover this year, hoping the bunnies will eat it instead of the lettuce. Good luck. I hope so for you too.
Do you have a recommendation of how far apart that plants have to be?
That's a good question. Years ago now, when I was just starting to garden, I read a book called Square Foot Gardening. And what the author was suggesting was that when you read on the seed packet, plant the carrots 3 inches apart with a foot between rows. Well, or 2 feet between rows. That's so you can walk between the rows to hoe them, and to weed them. But the fact that the carrots can grow 3 inches apart means that each carrot only needs that 3 square inch space. And you could just as easily plant a square foot with 4 rows of carrots 3 inches apart all through the row, if you follow that. And then you can walk along next to your square row and reach across the square foot to weed that. I have been planting using that kind of spacing. And obviously, carrots and peas can be 3 or 4 inches apart. Bush beans can be 4 or 5 inches apart. So the different plants, the tomatoes need more space. They need about 1.5 feet. So different plants need different spacing. But I plant in beds that are about 2.5 feet wide, and I do square foot gardening kind of spacing. I space close together, and I can reach in from the 2 sides of the bed to weed them and mulch them and water them and everything I need to do. Other,
There's lots of really great information in the chat area. I'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of everything that's going on in the chat. If you have any recommendations or anything that Louise isn't saying, a lot of people are doing that. I think Bev asked about resources. There are some resources here in the chat, but maybe Louise has some ideas of resources people can go to for help with questions like how far from a septic system must a garden be? What are the best vegetables to grow in our hardiness zone? What native food plants can we grow? How to succeed with seedlings inside? Lots of questions.
lots of questions. Okay. Seedlings inside need good lighting. You probably can't really see it very well, but I have a slight setup with fluorescent fixtures with LED lights, and that gives full spectrum because you want full spectrum light for your seedlings. So you can start your seedlings indoors if you can throw enough light at them. Like I said, I get fluorescent fixtures, but we put LED lights in them. And that does seem to make my plants happy. What were some of the other questions? What can you grow in our climate zone?
What about how far from a septic tank does a garden need to be?
Now that I don't know. Never having had a septic tank. One of the few things I have not done, if I had a septic tank, I would probably end up Googling it. Back when I first started gardening, I bought books and they gave me a lot of information, and then I went out and tried stuff. And some of the stuff I tried worked and some of the stuff I tried didn't. And that's how I learned.
So do you have any recommendations for resources that people can go to? Sounds like you know lots of books.
Oh man. Rodale Institute has been doing a lot of research and has published any number of books. So Rodale is a source for, and that they kind of got the whole organic gardening ball rolling. Before I even got into it, that they were kind of one of my sources. For a long time, they published a magazine called Organic Gardening, which they eventually, I guess they decided they'd gotten stale and didn't have anything new to say anymore, which was very sad. But a lot of what I learned I got from that, I'm sorry to tell you. But Rodale Institute is certainly a source for information about organic gardening and for books about it also.
That's R-O-D-A-L-E?
R-O-D-A-L-E, yeah. The problem with going to the ag institutes, the extension services, is that they, at least when I went to them when I was first starting out, it was all about what chemical fertilizers to apply, and that just wasn't where I was coming from. So they may have more to say about organic or regenerative agriculture now than they did 30 or 40 years ago. I'm not sure. Anybody else have some good ideas? I see someone who's put up something about a website about home guides regarding septic systems. What you can grow in your climate zone depends on your climate zone, by the way. So I know we have someone here from Florida, that's a completely different situation than me in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, the gardening season begins about now in April. I've planted my potatoes and peas and radishes. I'm hardening off my lettuces. Spinach could go in the ground now, but I'll be waiting to plant the stuff that's tender that would die if it got frozen. I won't be planting that until May. Used to be, I guess, the end of May. Now, of course, with global warming, it's a little earlier. It's mid-May. But in Florida, I don't even know what it's like in Florida. I just know that there's only a month or two when there's any danger of frost. So you would have a completely different situation about what you could plant when.
Can you say something about protecting gardens from rabbits and chipmunks and?
Yeah, there are, for organic gardeners who don't want to have traps and kill things. Rabbits are tough because they can go right under a fence. My problem here is deer, and I finally have just put up an 8-foot tall fence around my backyard plot. In the front, I use something called Plant Skyd, PLANTSKYDD, I think, Plant Skyd, which I bought from a catalog. It's basically blood, and that's what it smells like. And you don't spray it on anything you're going to eat, but you can spray it on the vegetation, and that will keep deer from eating it. But you have to keep reapplying it. And then once like the tomatoes or the peas start flowering, then I use netting, which is not an ideal solution for the deer because the plants grow through the netting, and then the deer will eat whatever has grown through the netting. So you have to have it kind of spread out across, above, and then down from stakes. It's a real nuisance. I believe the old adage used to be that you plant 3 times as much as you need. 1 portion for the critters, 1 portion for you, and 1 portion to save for next year's seed. Because we gardeners have been fighting with critters forever. But I find that Plant Skyd will keep critters from eating anything it's sprayed with. The problem is I can't spray the parts I want to eat, like the lettuce leaves. So that I use bird netting for. And it's helped a lot. It's not perfect.
Judith.
So for 3 years in a row, I had woodchucks, and woodchucks will decimate your garden in a heartbeat. They're very cute. They like smile at you from the rocks outside and go, ha ha, I'm going to go eat everything. And they do. They even, after they've eaten everything they like, which is all the coal crops, then they go after everything else. And I tried everything gentle, put a radio out, sprayed things with hot pepper spray, asked my husband to pee around the garden. I mean,
you just reminded me of something that works. You douse it with cayenne. The stronger the better.
None of those worked.
Cayenne.
Ended up having to buy a have-a-heart trap, in which, of course, we got a skunk and a raccoon and an opossum, but we finally got the woodchuck and then had to take it out to a wildlife area to release it. But we now have vegetables. So sometimes all those lovely, gentle things don't work. You just need to get a trap and say, I know you need a home, and I know we've eaten up all of your land, and I'm really sorry, but you can't eat my garden. Cool.
It needs a home, but not with me. Yeah. I hear you. But the cayenne, we actually, in my old garden in Wisconsin, did get a woodchuck, and the cayenne did work for that one. Maybe it was a wimpy woodchuck.
I had an ethnic woodchuck. It liked heat.
Other questions? By the way, how are we doing for timing? Because I think
We're going till 3:30. Is that what
we have till 3:30. What time is it now?
it's about 3 o'clock now.
Oh, okay, good. We have some more time. Other questions, discussions, issues?
Sean asks, anyone have a suggestion for specific edible things to plant to prevent soil erosion along the sides of mounded beds? We have a slightly sloped garden space.
Almost anything with roots holds soil is the first thing that comes to mind. You would almost want something perennial. And I'm not sure what's perennial and edible and holds soil. Strawberries are perennial and edible, but they're not deep rooted. They're very shallow rooted.
Do you have any suggestion on where it can buy a lighting system for seedlings?
I solved that one by saying to my husband, who is the techie, he's an engineer, okay? And I said to him, I need a light setup. And he went online and did some research. And what he ended up buying, mail ordering, so you can have it delivered, was the kind of thing that they use for to hold the lights for like rock concerts where they have to take them down and disassemble them and take them to a new venue and reassemble them, which makes it possible for us to disassemble it and store it in the garage during the summer and fall and early winter, and then reassemble it in February to start the lettuces with. And basically, he takes care of it.
So you don't know where he got it from, but it's the kind of equipment that they use for rock concerts.
Yeah, maybe I can find. Chuck, are you there? Chuck, are you there?
Okay, well, you'll find out and let us know.
That's a question.
There's a statement from Cheryl Goodridge. Maybe she could explain this to us. Tin foil on poles around the garden helps to keep them away. Cheryl?
It's for lighting for shows.
Yeah.
It's for the deer, to keep the deer away.
To keep
Scares them apparently.
Oh, really? Tin foil on poles?
On just poles, just, like you use for the winter, if you have a plow service, just something like that on the edges. I have a raised bed, so on the edges works, seems to work.
Whatever works. I am informed that my husband found our light setup on Amazon and confirms that it's the kind of thing they use for rock concerts.
Yeah, and this part is a U-channel. It's used in electrical work. So I've bridged it by putting two of these on.
So
it's like a conduit for the electrical, is that it?
Yeah, it's actually like channel, U-channel. And it's used, you bolt down conduit with it. There's like clips that go on it that'll hold the conduit.
Okay.
You're dealing with a bunch of people like me.
Okay.
Oh, right, somebody used lights from Lowe's. Yeah, and of course I need a couple, we have a couple of, tables that you can set up and take down easily that I actually put the plant trays on underneath the lights.
Deb is saying, Michael B. would love to discuss your tree planting initiative sometime regarding also values. Shomrei Adama.
Oh. Ha. What's that?
Deb, do you want to say something about that?
Initiatives. Yeah. Deb, you have something to say? Or should I?
Well, Deb and I were just trading messages back and forth, just to some of the different kinds of Jewish values. And we're in our county, there's actually a planting 100,000 trees in the next 10 years, which is very much an act of carbon sequestration. Has a beautiful Jewish tie-in, because just like JNF for how many decades said everybody take a little bit of money, put it aside so you can plant trees in Israel. We're hoping to do that not just for the Jewish community, but be able to turn it into a whole county-wide program. So some of it's garden, but also some of it's trees. And one of the types of trees we're really looking at is also fruit trees as well. So not only are you planting trees, but you're then having a source of food for folks, especially in food deserts.
There's two ways of going when we talk about planting trees. One is food forests, where you're planting trees that produce fruits and nuts. And that, as you say, especially in places that don't have good grocery stores, is a way to add food to a community. The other thing, the other consideration or different way to go is if you're planting trees, to plant the trees that are native to the area you're in, because that's a whole other thing, and I come at that from my native plant gardening background. The base of the food chain is the insects. The insects that live in a particular biome need the plants that live in that biome, because otherwise, if the insects don't have the plants that they are specialized for, then they're not there. And if the insects aren't there, the birds aren't there, and the toads and frogs and snakes aren't there, and everything up the food chain. So we need, as a world, we need to be planting more trees, and the ones that aren't being planted for food need to be natives to whatever area you're planting in. I see a note from someone, and please use LED lights, and I do. But also not just because they give full spectrum to my plants, but they're the most efficient. Yes. Agreed. Other thoughts, comments, questions?
You were talking about trees a moment ago. Thank you for the shout out for LEDs. That was my comment. Very important. And we are a climate group, Jewish Climate Action Network, and Vice President Fred Davis he's a high efficiency lighting expert and company owner. He would want us to say that as well. You were talking about planting trees, and I think that's very important too, to think about the structure of our biome. If we have lawns or even cropping alone, it's more or less two-dimensional. But if we add shrubs and trees, we're adding a third dimension and more complexity and more biological diversity, as you said.
And the thing is that a lawn and non-native foundation plantings is like a biotic desert as far as insects and birds go. But even if you just take part of, assuming you have a lawn in the first place, if you take part of it and change it over to some trees and some understory, a couple of big trees and some understory trees and some shrubs and some wildflowers, and that's all, and as many of those natives as possible. You're creating habitat for all the insects and everything else up the food chain.
And pollinators too.
And exactly, the pollinators and everything. So you're reinvigorating and revivifying the whole food chain and the whole biome that you're part of. I see a question about how can we approach planting more perennials and trees when city land is threatened by developers? And yes, it is. Street trees, even in developed areas, you have street trees. And they should be a variety of different trees and should be as many natives as possible. So at least whenever there's a choice of what to plant something in a place where there is a place to plant something, try to look for the trees that are natives to an area. But it's also, I guess that's where we need to get into political activity to try to convince zoning boards to leave some green space and not to let developers take over everything. And then wherever there is green space, to try to utilize it in the best possible ways.
Yes, Judith. You can unmute yourself.
So I have a friend who goes around to churches and synagogues because lawns are pretty utterly useless things. If you want a green lawn, it just you put in a lot of water and a lot of nasty pesticides to keep out all the other things that grow. So lawns are utterly useless. So she does this great talk on the origin of lawns, and it's a great way to speak to people in your community about the large lawn in front of their houses of worship. And lawns were developed so that the people in the castle could see the enemy coming. It could be just forest, and then your enemy could come through the forest and then attack your castle. So the king said, let's cut down those trees and get rid of that forest. And then what did they have? They had mud. And then when all your peasants come and they have to do all their transactions in hideous mud, and so they grew grass. And so the question for your houses of worship is, are you worried about enemies attacking from the front? How about taking that earth and turning it into something that can actually generate good?
And there are so many ways to address landscaping. So that, I mean, most people wouldn't be happy with just growing up a forest, but you could have a low planting of strawberries, a good native ground cover, and then rising up around that be all these native plants. And it's also partly a matter of people getting a better, changing their aesthetics. This one man, writer and insect specialist, Doug Talamy, who's written a couple of books about landscaping and how we can and should change what we do and plant natives to support the whole rest of the ecosystem, talks about having a strip of mown lawn around a wide planting of, say, prairie plants, native prairie plants. The strip of lawn makes it look tended, so then you don't feel like it's given over to wilderness. But then most of the area is given to biotically useful plants. So there's a lot of ways to address getting rid of most of the lawn without offending people's aesthetics.
I want to quickly add a comment about synagogues and congregations as well, in between my dogs barking. Sorry. There's an opportunity as, again, we're Jewish Climate Action Network, there's an opportunity around congregations to, once people are meeting again or answering phones again, to use the synagogues as a place to grow food, communal food, to have community gardens and to plant shrubs. They don't need lawns, as you said. So there's a role for activists to try to get their congregations to work communally towards the things we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I hope people take advantage of that.
Yeah, and have a kind of a whole setup where the congregation garden feeds to a food pantry.
Yes, I agree. Definitely.
So did we miss any questions that are in the chat? I can feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand, and we'll make sure that we get to everybody if we didn't get to your questions. There's so much on the chat, great information. And we'll definitely save the chat's information. Bev, did you get all your questions answered?
No, the one that I really wanted to have answered in this forum is the carbon footprint of regenerative versus veganic agriculture, if anyone knows the answer to that.
Regenerative versus what?
Veganic agriculture, all
Vegan.
plant-based.
As in-
Veganic means totally
Yes.
plant-based. You don't use animal manure unless it's your companion animal.
Right. I would say that veganic agriculture would be a subset of organic regenerative agriculture. I'm married to a vegan, and I have been acquainted with many vegans, and many of them are very serious about it and fine. What they do is there are a number of plants you can use as green manure, and that's what they use for soil amendments. So it's certainly, as somebody mentioned on the chat at some point, that beans fix nitrogen. Yes. Beans, I'm experimenting now with a cover crop that's oats and peas. Peas are legumes that fix nitrogen. So that any kind of this green manure, which is basically a way of saying green plants that add fertility to the soil, is certainly something that, a way that you can go if you want to go vegan, and it certainly fits in within the context of regenerative agriculture. I myself find it hard to envision the whole world going vegan anytime soon. So there will probably continue to be manure available, animal products available for soil amendments for those who choose to use them, but you don't have to. Does that?
My question is the regenerative agriculture that I've heard about generally uses animals in that model. And as you're saying, this is a subset, the veganic is a subset, so it doesn't have to. But do you know the carbon footprint of the fully veganic versus the regenerative that uses animals?
well, in a world that uses animals, it depends on how they're used. Because if you're pasturing poultry in ways that cause it to be a living, thriving turf, then that probably is helpful. If you're doing animal agriculture with factory farms or with which use feed that they get from industrial ag fields, or if you're doing feedlots with lots and lots of cattle belching methane all over the place, then that is definitely a negative. I don't know, is that answering the question?
No, my question is, in the best of the animal world, using
Yes.
animals in
Right.
regenerative agriculture, my understanding as in the vegan world is it's still better to use veganic because you're putting less carbon into the and less pollution into the air. That just even the what the cows give off themselves, even if they're in a good situation. So if somebody could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
So what I've heard about that is that it doesn't necessarily come down, I put this in the chat, but it doesn't necessarily come down to CO2 as much as it comes down to methane. And the people who would say that it's, that animal husbandry doesn't have to be as much of a problem, have presented some evidence that maybe methane is, the methane levels are not as damaging as they have appeared to be. I do not have, I haven't looked at like the science in depth. That's the explanation I've heard. My instinct would be that you would want to minimize animal husbandry if you're concerned about that. But again, to Louise's point, unfortunately, and again, longtime vegetarian, I don't think that like everybody is going to stop, but it's a question of, I also think that, and this is something that like I've kind of been struggling with, like it's not necessarily, we all agree factory farming, bad, like put a big like circle with a red line through it, that's bad. But we may not need to take a position just this second on whether or not, on where we fall on the whole like animal husbandry continuum, and for the right now and for the next program that we're going to have, it's not like, I live in Boston. I think if we can get chickens, like that's amazing. Like that's just, it's hard to do that kind of like homesteading in most of the environments that we're in. But, maybe that's literally a subject for another day, a subject that we should explore.
Definitely. I would give it this much context, that I've read analyses of climate impact from different diets. And they do all indicate that vegan diets have the lowest climate impact of the different diets. But they also mostly tend to, the consensus I've seen so far is that if everyone who did eat animal products only ate a little tiny bit of them and ate plant-based diets with just little bits of a little eggs, a little fish, a little poultry, and very, very little, as a very small percentage of their diet, that would be adequate to the need to control the climate instability. That we could have agriculture with just little bits of animal products and still make it. And for me, what this feeds into is the idea that there are certain areas where the only agricultural use of the land is grazing. I'm thinking of having hiked in in Yorkshire, in the I'm blanking on the word.
Moors.
The moors. And a moor is basically a peat bog on top of a mountain. There is no agricultural use for that, but we saw some sheep grazing. And that's the only agricultural use for that land. There's a situation in North America where there's this huge underground aquifer, the Oglawa Aquifer, that they're using to irrigate the whole Midwest, and we're using it up. It's residual from the glacial age. When it's gone, and the whole Midwest reverts to grassland, and there will be no more wheat cropping or corn cropping there. So then it might be that at that point, the only agricultural use of that land would be for grazing. However, if you're grazing animals, you have a lot fewer animals if you're doing it sustainably and in ways that don't overgraze and destroy the turf. So that would feed into a situation where there's a little bit of animal products, but very little relative to what we've been used to in the past. So that's one way that things might end up going. I would say vegan is great if that's what you do, but I'm not going to be the one to tell everybody they have to go vegan. I don't think that's realistic.
I just want to be able to tell people accurate information. So if vegan is your goal, in terms of the maximum benefit to the planet, yes, I want to be able to say that. And if it's not true, I don't want to say that.
I think that is true, yes. I'm just not holding my breath on the whole world agreeing to actually go there.
Louise, this has been really wonderful. Thank you so much for all of this information. And also thank you to all the people who put all kinds of incredible resources into the chat.